So welcome everyone. Thank you for making it here to join us on this last day of our virtual faculty college. We're up for another great day with Dr. Stephen Brookfield talking about equity-minded pedagogy. Before we get there, we have a little bit of an introduction this morning, building from yesterday. So if you were here yesterday, you met me then, but for those who weren't able to join yesterday, I'm Heather Pelzel. I'm a faculty member at UW-Whitewater in the biology department, but I am also the co-director of the Wisconsin Teaching Fellows and Scholars program. So the Wisconsin Teaching Fellows and Scholars program is a year-long cohort-based program that focuses on SOTL, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And yesterday I mentioned how we weren't able to start normally last year because of the pandemic switch. We did something a little bit different, right? We did a summer reading group instead. And one of the books that we were able to read was Dr. Brookfield's Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. Now, this year at Faculty College, we are kicking off our year-long SOTL experience in this new virtual format. We're still going to be online for a while, but one of the things we wanted to do today is invite a couple of our WTFS participants to the stage to share their connections from last summer's readings to this summer's workshops, and then, how this year has played out for them and any other connections they want to make. Also joining me today more on stage is my brand new co-director. So we had another switch to Valerie Barske from UW Stevens Point. Valerie is going to be here moderating the chat today, and she will be providing our closing at the end of today. All right, so our two participants that are joining us today, I should say, are Andrea Ivanov from UW-Platteville in the History Department, and Jessica Van Slooten, who is at UW Green Bay in the English Writing and Women and Gender Studies programs. And I gave quotation marks when I said joining us because unfortunately, Andre had a family event going on and isn't able to join us in person, but he did record some sentiments for us, some reflection. And so I'm going to share just a few minutes of his reflection, and we will post his entire video so you could watch the whole thing later with some of the other recordings as well, if you'd like. All right, so I am going to share my screen. There we go. All right, so I'm kind of jumping into the middle of Andre's sentiments here. And if you've read Dr. Brookfield's Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher, he tells a story about learning how to swim. And so Andre was sharing a similar story and building from that analogy. So if he mentions jumping in the deep end and swimming, that's kind of where it's coming from.
Learning to navigate the waters of pedagogy in a catastrophe is not something that I expected when I joined the great faculty of the University of Wisconsin system. This was some 6 years ago. Yet there I was in March of 2020, thrown into the proverbial water and told to manage this as best as I can. See fit, just to stay afloat. Stay afloat. We were facing a crisis, a catastrophe, a pandemic. And as a result, I had to catastrophize my lifestyle, my curriculum, my teaching in the midst of it all. We all had to stay afloat. We all had to do the impossible. To paraphrase the words of the famous 1980 Yes Minister saying, we had to grit our teeth and bite the bullet, knowing full well how physiologically impossible it is to bite the bullet while you're gritting your teeth. The pandemic has certainly appended a lot of comfort zones and assumptions in my teaching. For example, I was humbled by the inability to use, quote, charismatic demonstration, end of quote, in my regular lectures that often overemphasize the dynamism of the lecture to augment the student's interest in the subject through such dynamism. Instead of demonstrative teaching, I found myself listening to students more, however best they could express themselves, through Zoom and back channel communications.
So I will pause there, and Andre kind of continues that theme of how he had to make adjustments in his teaching this year in response to his, being thrown into the deep end, which is maybe an analogy many of you can relate to. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to share some of her thoughts with us.
All right, thank you, Heather, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be able to talk with you today. And I really want to thank Stephen for modeling his own positionality and vulnerability in yesterday's session. That really resonated with me. And I was really excited at the end of the session yesterday to see the survey questions that he asked us to fill out on the Slido, because that was one of the most important parts of the book we read. I have to show it off, Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. Was this critical incident questionnaire. And it is something that I took from the book, and the questions we were asked in the last prompt yesterday are versions of that questionnaire. And I was able to adapt that in all of my classes this past year. I taught asynchronous online, and I had students complete some version of this. I tweaked it a little bit. And they did that 3 times over the course of the semester as a Canvas quiz that was actually built into their grade in the class. And as long as they posted something, they got full credit. And what was really wonderful about that opportunity for student feedback is it allowed multiple things to happen. Students told me about small Canvas tweaks that would make the course easier for them to navigate. I was able to respond to that feedback right away. Another really powerful thing happened is that a topic would come up in the class and a student would say, I'm really confused about this, but I don't want to ask in the discussion forum that's public, right? So can you tell me more about this? And that allowed me to have a conversation with the student where they really wanted to learn something and challenge their pre-existing beliefs. And this was around cultural appropriation, so also it had sort of an equity minded content to it as well. And then finally, this is a place where a lot of students ended up sharing their own struggles and challenges, right? Honestly, I'm not doing well, right? I have more hours at my job, or I'm really struggling with my mental health. And it allowed me to validate their concerns, remind them of my own policies, which were incredibly generous, and work out a plan for them to get other support they might need, and then support within the class. So I'm really thankful to have that framework that Stephen introduced. And while I had been doing some version of that before, I would only do it once at midterm. And so doing it more regularly was really helpful. And I would also share that students regularly said, I love that you ask us these questions. It shows us that you actually really care about us as individuals. And I wish more professors did something like this. So to me, that was a testament to the value of just creating a space for them to be asked for their feedback, right? And I think the other thing that Stephen explains really well in the book is how to respond to feedback and how to navigate our innate sense of defensiveness, right? Especially when feedback is maybe challenging us as individuals or our values. And I'm anticipating that that's part of what he's probably going to do today, right? In that he shared some of the responses in the email yesterday. The final thing that I wanted to mention is that I find that this framework is helpful not only in the individual class, but in some institutional frameworks around teaching and pedagogy. And so we were able to use some of his methods of looking at multiple forms of feedback around peer feedback, student feedback, self-reflection, and theory are sort of 4 lenses of feedback that he recommends. And we were able to build that into some of the processes at Green Bay for revising our evaluations of teaching effectiveness. And hopefully that way too, creating a culture where we are valuing feedback from multiple places and multiple voices. So I guess that would be the other connection I'm making, is that this equity-minded pedagogy can happen on the micro level, but can happen on the macro level as well. And I'm thankful for the inspiration I had from reading Stephen's book and being part of this program.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing that with us. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Brookfield back to Faculty College today and kick off day 2 of equity-minded pedagogy. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you to Professors Van Slooten and Ivanov for their opening remarks. One of my favorite questions to pose to colleagues is, what would you like students or colleagues to say about your work when you are out of earshot? And so I often imagine a group of students is, lining up in the cafeteria to get coffee or food. What would I want them to say about what I'm doing? And the comment that I would treasure the most is that something that I did was useful. So it was just really nice to hear how my work had been used by colleagues and had been helpful in that regard. And indeed, as Jessica mentioned, we are going to look at the critical incident questionnaire responses. So if you remember, or as Jessica mentioned, the last thing that we did yesterday was I asked you to fill out an adaptation of the CIQ. So I was asking you, at what moments were you most engaged or distanced as a participant? So I was asking you to focus on moments. And then I was asking you also to focus on actions. What action that anyone yesterday took was most helpful or puzzling? And then there was a more open-ended question on what surprised you most at the end. And I used to use more Likert scale type things earlier in my career. And then over time, I just found that asking questions about moments and actions produced a greater specificity of feedback. So what I did yesterday, there were about 81 postings to the page on Slido that we had open for this. And then I noticed a couple more had come in overnight this morning. What I do is, first of all, I'm looking for things that a lot of people are talking about. So doing a basic frequency analysis. And if something gets mentioned by 10% of the participants, then it makes it into the report, which I'm giving today, and also came around in an email from Faye yesterday. But then I also report on smaller clusters and also on individual comments, because as I think we were talking yesterday at one point, that if you focus only on common themes that come out and neglect individual, what you might describe as outliers, you're robbing the chance possibly to identify a major omission or a major blindness, or to deal with a really provocative dynamic that one person has really been aware of and that has escaped your attention. So that's what I've done in the form, in this reporting out process. So when you do a CIQ, critical incident questionnaire, it's absolutely crucial that you do what I'm doing this morning, which is report out the results of the feedback to the whole community and open a space for reactions, comments, questions, and feedback to it. So you don't keep this feedback private, you make it community property. So you've had the chance, hopefully, to open this link and see what's in it. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time going through everything, but it was very clear that the breakout rooms were really, really appreciated by, there were 40 mentions of this. That could have been 40 people, or could have been 35, and someone mentioned it twice. But of the 81 comments that were up there, almost half were about the breakout rooms being, for you, one of the best parts of the morning. So clearly, we're going to emphasize that today. In fact, I'm bringing the breakout activity a little bit forward so we can get to that sooner. However, this was not a universal experience. So it's always interesting to me to point out the different responses that people have, because part of this tool is trying to show participants that there are multiple worlds in the same space, online or in an actual face-to-face classroom. So there were 10 comments on how the small group was disappointing. A couple of people said, you know, too few voices dominated. I felt shamed as a white person. It was uncomfortable for me to speak up. My suggestions were criticized when I did say, well, how about we try this or that? I felt that some were engaged, others weren't in it. I felt dismissed by male participants as a woman in the group. And I also felt speaking up as a woman. So gender dynamics, power dynamics, the lack of commitment of others in the group were something that were mentioned. The slides, the next group of comments sort of split. Well, 15 found the slides helpful to kind of set up the day and the discussion and introduce some concepts. And a lot of you resonated with the example of the circle that I used. You know, I talked about arranging chairs in a circle, which seemed to me to be an unproblematic sharing of power. And to the students, some students, not all, was experienced as a form of surveillance and a lack of opportunity to build trust. So a lot of you resonated with that particular example. But there were 6 mentions of my lecture, my mini kind of presentations as distancing. The slides were too dense, and I know I have a really bad tendency in that regard, so I need to keep working on that. And there were, someone mentioned the use of Eurocentric metaphors when I talked about the Politburo and Siberia, Politburo, and the pro-male verbs. Sorry, that says pro-make, that should be pro-male, excuse me. Plunder, loot, steal. So for that person, I lost credibility immediately. 12 mentions of you like my modeling, and that for me is a theme I'll be continuing today, the absolute necessity to model your own commitment to equity practices. And the CIQ, this particular mechanism, is a way of hopefully doing that. Things you particularly appreciated, the addressing the elephant in the room, my own identity as a white person, yet another white person running an equity workshop. The Zoom chat, 8 of you found the Zoom distancing. Your eye, whether you liked it or not, and your mind was drawn to the frequent comments that came up. Although 2 people did say we appreciate it. And then the practicality, I always assume that in these kinds of events as a participant, if I can leave and I've got an idea about something I can do differently in my own practice, then I feel like that's been a good use of my time. So I'm always trying to, emphasize the practical stuff. And when I use theory, I only use it if it helps me understand my world and negotiate it better. The I am from exercise, 6 mentions of this as distancing or puzzling. This was the introductory sentence completion prompts that I sent round. And there was this feeling from those 6 that it was inauthentic and people were hiding their true selves. And it didn't give a clear image of where I am now. 3, however, picked that out as an enjoyable thing to do. Nice to see that 6 people felt engaged all the time. 6 people mentioned the time to think, which is something I was at pains to introduce as an important dynamic in the workshop yesterday, that we don't move straight to questions. We don't move straight to completing a Slido response. Give you 90 seconds for that. I give you 2 minutes to think about the small group stuff that's going on. And then lots of individual comments about what you found to be surprising. And I've just given an example of some of them there on the screen. It was interesting. There were some who found the lack of discussion of application in STEM fields was a surprise, and another person's said, I was surprised how many people are engaged in this. So I guess it depended on which particular group that you ended up with. So from all of this feedback, what I take is that the opportunity for interaction certainly has to be guarded and is most appreciated by you. And that my own modeling is something I need to pay attention to. And that broadly speaking, I'd say that my assumptions that I went into yesterday with as an educator were broadly confirmed. So it's not as if I learned something that shifted my worldview. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But when you find that that overall your assumptions seem to be broadly correct, not for everybody, not for all the time, for everybody all the time, I think that's an example of confirmatory feedback. So for me, this was an example of confirmatory critical thinking yesterday. I analyzed my assumptions, I opened myself up to multiple perspectives, and it seems that they were broadly confirmed. So I want to move into our time together now. And just say that, again, we're going to be looking specifically at racial equity today. We've done the critical incident questionnaire, so we can skip all that stuff. The results have impacted the planning in terms of bringing in the breakout stuff earlier. And just to underscore what I've just done and I'm trying to do are the following. I'm trying to equalize for the whole community the same chance to comment on how they're experiencing the workshop, training, or the class. I also use this when I've been department chair as a tool to evaluate department meetings. So at the end of every bi-weekly or monthly department meeting, I would ask people to fill out the CIQ, and I'd ask a member of my staff to collect them. And then I'd never see any of them. That person would read out the summary as the first item of business the next time the department got together. And that would surface a lot about my own practices as a department chair, the kinds of things we were not doing that we needed to be doing, and the things that people appreciated that we were doing. And I find that just on a practical level, you don't have to use my questions or anything, but somehow regularly checking in and asking people to provide comment on how they're experiencing what's happening to them, and then reporting that comment back and talking about what it means for your practice, that really alerts you to problems that are developing. I started doing this maybe 30 something years ago. I've never had a course or a series of trainings or faculty development things blow up unexpectedly in my face since. I've had a lot of things blow up, but I've always known they were coming, and I've been able to anticipate what's going on, try and address the problematic dynamics that are going on in there. And I also, as I said earlier, I think this shows how different people experience an event. And to use a German critical theorist, Jürgen Habermas, those of you in this field will know his work probably. I like his idea that people are entering adulthood when they cease to universalize their own experience, when they start to realize my experience should not be generalized as that of everybody else. And that's such an important dynamic to get to, not just in adulthood, but particularly in equity work, that you stop universalizing your experience and assuming that it's everybody else's. This also allows you, doing something like this, to build a case to students for why you're constantly switching modalities. So pretty much everything I talked about yesterday, people liked and also people didn't like. So that then allows me to say, well, remember, I know that now we're moving to small groups. Some people will love this, but there was a group who found my comments helpful in laying a foundation. So I'm also going to say some things. And then the importance of silence was specifically mentioned. So that's why we're moving into a silent period of thought and reflection. And hopefully over time, this does foster an honest critique of your actions and allows you to respond in a way that's non-defensive. So I just wanted to let you know again that we have an opportunity for you to ask questions over Zoom chat, but also over Slido. The Zoom chat will be, your identity will be revealed unless it's a private message just to me. The Slido is anonymous, and you can also use the QR code on your phone. So at that point, I just wanted to pause and see if there's anything, Valerie, that's come up in the chat room around the use of the CIQ that I need to address.
Yes. Yeah, Stephen, I think the first question would be, why is it called the Critical Incident Questionnaire? Perhaps there's a suggestion by that naming that they would like you to comment on. So just explain the CIQ part.
Yes, it's because actually it's probably not the best term for it at all, but a long time ago, I was introduced to the work of Flanagan's work with the Air Force around the use of critical incidents, specific moments that people remembered as significant and could be called easily to mind. So what I wanted to do was get at those experiences students were having that they thought were significant and memorable and important enough to convey to me. So it really came from Flanagan's critical incident methodology. And since then, I've just, as an educator, and a staff developer, faculty developer, activist, trainer, just interested in the use of people sharing significant moments that for them encapsulate that something important is happening to them. So I think if you get people to focus on those things, you learn an awful lot in a short time. So that's where that comes from.
Great, thank you for that. And just some questions as to which Slido is actually still active, which code we're supposed to be using, making sure that that participatory channel is still open.
Thank you. Let me just go back and bring that up again. I'm I had some connectivity problems, so I'm trying to keep my bandwidth as broadly open as possible. So the Slido, it is 5:37, 4:23. So if you just want to jot that down on a piece of paper or open up the screen yourself and keep it open for the rest of the time, that's where we're going to go.
Stephen, it seems like that one is not open, but I'm wondering if the one you gave us, the CIQ, the 777377 might be open still. Is that possible?
That one is still open. Yes.
Okay. So perhaps that's the one shared by Faye in the chat, the 777377, where we had the CIQ prompt from yesterday.
I do apologize. So let's use that one. 777. It's all sevens except one number. 777, 377. 777, 377. So clearly I don't need this slide up on the screen. Now I want to say a few things as we move into how we do equity pedagogy, particularly around issues of racial equity. But is there anything else I can respond to in the Q&A? No. Okay. So I'm going to just say a few things to prep us for moving into a different breakout room protocol. And particularly focus on how we prepare ourselves for this kind of work that's teaching, that's incorporating race, particularly if this is something that you're coming to as, you know, for the first time. And now because of everything that's going on in the world and everything that is going on in the university and in your communities, you decide we need to try and incorporate an attention on racial identity, racial equity in my class as much as possible. So there's basically, how I think of it, two kinds of prep you can do. There's the technical stuff, which of course is crucial. There is so much out there in terms of scholarship, personal narratives, literature, statistical research. There are incredible digital narratives out there. You can be looking at different conceptions of racism, white identity, white supremacy, what constitutes anti-Blackness, lots of stuff you can read to prepare yourself. And then you can also think through the methodology. And that's mostly what we've been focusing on so far. So how you model your own disclosure, how you use narratives, both personal and digital, how you build trust and scaffold learning, moving from simple to complex, using specific protocols like the circle of voices that we tried yesterday. But I think what's just as important, and in some ways more so because it's not really, doesn't get as much attention, is the emotional preparation for this. And the way that as a teacher, you have to often, at least I'll speak for myself, this was for me, I had to change my whole paradigm of what effective and successful teaching would look like, so that when I got home at the end of the day, I could say to myself, this was a good day's work. And mostly when I got to the end of the day and thought this was a good day's work, I'd have images of classrooms that were full of conversation, where people were having lots of aha moments, when I could sense a real building cumulative energy in the class, where the time was peppered with fantastic questions, which is usually my shorthand indicator that something is going on, is the quality of questions that students raise, which is why I'm always opening up multiple channels for questions. But that doesn't apply, at least in my experience, in preparing emotionally for race, to teach about race. So what I have to understand is that this issue is of such complexity and depth and is so core to people's sense of who they are and how they negotiate the world, that it's going to be inherently very emotional at times. Not all the time, but there are going to be emotions where people express feelings of anger, of deep anxiety and distress, when they're going to feel very uncomfortable in the moment. And that is going to be at times part and parcel. That's just the nature of the process. And I'm going to feel as well, at the end of most of the sessions I do around this topic, that I've screwed it up. I'm going to look back and think, man, I wish I could go back and say this, or I wish instead of doing this, I'd done that. So I'm going to leave feeling a sense of personal disappointment. And the reason I have that sense of disappointment is because my class has not exemplified what I used to think was a good class, full of conversation, full of good feeling, lots of aha moments, questions being peppered that are fantastic. So someone said to me about 10 years ago, it was one of the most helpful things they said, there's two ways to do anti-racist work: imperfectly or not at all. And if I could sort of crochet something on a screen and frame it, I'd probably have that in my office or taped on my laptop desk. Two ways to do anti-racist work: imperfectly or not at all. And another dynamic, just quickly, I need to remember, I found this in Ali Michael's book, Raising Race Questions, published by TC Press a few years ago. He made the point that when you're working with groups comprised of different racial identities, sometimes it's helpful to think there are two very different levels of understanding that you have in your group. Many of the white students, again, not all, because you can't generalize, and people are at different stages in terms of their development around this issue, but assume that a significant number of the white students are going to be at an arithmetic level of understanding of the dynamics of pervasive structural racism. So if you've not thought about this stuff before, it's coming as the first time you've really got into it, that's kind of where you are. Then the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color members of the group are going to assume that most of them are operating at a calculus level of understanding. They have lived this stuff on a daily basis. So their understanding of how racism and white supremacy works, how it's internalized, how it goes unnoticed and accepted as normal, and how this disadvantages and disproportionately affects them, that's at a calculus level. So you wouldn't have students in the same room, in the same class, and teach both all the time in the same way. So this means that one of the things I'm interested in, we can get into this later if anyone wants to go deeper into it. I'll often do a lot of racial affinity groups work. If I'm discussing race, I'll ask students for some of the time to speak to each other in white only groups, and then in BIPOC only groups, or there'll often be a group of biracial or multiracial identities, or sometimes we'll break the groups down even more specifically in terms of a specific racial identity. And one of the reasons for doing that is because I think one of the biggest pieces of feedback I've had over the years from students of color is that we are tired of constantly being asked to teach our white peers, but we're also tired of seeing white students have these aha moments and being expected to, give them props for that. So I'm just going to give you time to read this one excerpt from a particular piece that illustrates this by Carmina May, who was a student in a workshop that I was running in New York. And she was in a group, and a small group, and in that small group, a white woman spent a lot of time talking about her process of becoming aware of racism, how it lived within her, how it lived within her family, how she had tried to become more knowledge about it, and so on. So just take your time to read through that quote. So for me, Carmina encapsulates on the screen here a dynamic that I think we all need to be aware of, particularly those of us who have a white racial identity and are eager to be what Shannon Sullivan calls a good white person. We're eager to earn what Brenda Juarez calls a good white medal. So just to wrap up, and then we'll see responses, and then we'll move into some conversation amongst all of us. As I'm thinking about how to get ready for teaching with race in mind, this broad strategy sequence of steps is really helpful. It begins on the top left, and then it progresses through to the bottom right. So it's very important that we do the emotional work of reframing what counts as perfection and understanding that there's going to be multiple silences. This is tough stuff. We need to have time to think and process it, which is why I always try and build in structured silence much more intentionally now than I used to do before. So when you have a long, awkward silence, when you pose a provocative question and no one responds, just trust that the reason they're not responding is because it's a difficult and complex question, and we need time to think through it. And try and model being unafraid of silence. I think, and this has been important for me, I always used to start with students' personal testimony around racism. Now I realize that in most times I need to do a more introductory step, insert an introductory step there of sending around reading and viewing. And I particularly emphasize viewing because the use of digital narratives, personal narratives around how racism is experienced are just very, very powerful teaching tools. And they give the community, especially if it's an all racial identities group, something which everybody can focus on. And so we can get into conversations around race and avoid some of the confessional mode that sometimes dominates early discussions. We need to take the emotional temperature, get a sense of how people are feeling. I use Slido. I have a poll set up there. I use a tool called Mood Meter. Some of you may know about that. It's a where people pick a color on a chart that represents where they are right now. I do a lot of self-disclosure. So my responsibility is to be the first one always to raise race or to strive to do that as just a normal matter of conversation and to talk about my own engagement with race that morning, that week, that day. I try and introduce the concept of brave space. We can go into this in more detail if people are interested when we come back after the breakout groups. But brave space is where you prepare students for the fact that these conversations are going to be uncomfortable. There is going to be an expression of strong emotions. There is going to be a lot of silence and confusion, and we're not going to end in agreement or consensus. We're going to end understanding there are multiple worlds in the same classroom, which again is why the CIQ or something like it is such a great in the moment tool for me, because it allows me to say to the students, you see your responses to last week's question, how that shows there are multiple worlds here. There are people sitting right next to us that we're going to coffee with, talking about the assignments with, who experience this in a 180-degree different way. You need to have, I think, structured conversational protocols. We're going to try out the circular response in a little bit. For example, we did circular voices yesterday, and then you just need to keep checking in via anonymous channels. And that's why I like things like Slido and back channel chat. So that's an attempt to kind of prime the pump for your conversations in a moment. I hope in priming the pump, I haven't flooded the village, but I'd just like to pause and see if there are questions that have been raised that people, Valerie, you can summarize them, or if others want to ask a question directly, that's fine too, using the raised hand function.
Great, thank you. There are several affirmations of recognizing the importance of the emotional component of the work that you're talking about. So that's coming out in various ways in the chat. There is a question about when you were talking about digging down deeper into the CIQ questions and comments for frequency analysis. Is there a specific tool that you use for that, something online that would help that analysis, expedite that analysis?
No, the tool I use is a piece of paper. I read through all the responses first. From that first read, I realize there are certain themes that people keep mentioning. So I put a theme here, a theme here, a theme here, a theme here. And then I go through them a second time and I notice new themes. And I just do a quick notation. Okay, this theme comes up. And I notice how many times it's mentioned. That's it. At the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I taught for about 30 years, I had a 15-minute bus ride home. I taught a lot of classes that were around 25 to 30, which was nice. I wasn't teaching very many 200, 300 size classes. And in 15 minutes, I could do a pretty good analysis of a 25 to 30 sized class. So I would use my ride home to do my CIQ. And then at the next time I met the class the following week, I'd give them the summary and do what I did earlier with you all.
And then there was a question. I know we did the circle of voices yesterday. Maybe we're going to do the circular response today, but what was the Bohmian dialogue?
Bohmian dialogue. So if we were meeting for a third day, we might try Bohmian dialogue tomorrow. Bohmian dialogue, you usually allow a minimum of an hour. So it's a long exercise. It's based on the work of David Bohm. Some of you know him, the theoretical physicist. And so it seems for some strange to use something that's come from the natural sciences, but he uses it as a problem-solving protocol. And colleagues that I work with find this very adaptable to looking at complex questions of race and other forms of exclusion. So what happens is you show everybody, at least is how I do it, you get everybody to read something or everybody to view something. And I like to begin a Bohmian dialogue with everybody viewing a live video. in the class. So we spend, if we, have an hour and a half, maybe we'll spend 15 minutes watching 1 or 2 videos. So everybody is working from the same information. And the videos I often go to, particularly at introductory levels, are they're in one of the earlier slides. One of them, I think, a conversation about race, New York Times series, a conversation about race, which is about 10 different conversations around different aspects of race and racism. Everybody views those, and then you pose a question, and the question will depend on what particular dimension of racism you're looking at. And then you say to the group, let's assume that most of the time now we're going to be silent. If you want to close your eyes to focus your thoughts, that's fine. And I will often, as the instructor, then close my eyes, because that is how I can think better if I cut out external stimuli. And then I say, when someone is ready to say something about their own personal response to what we have just viewed, then speak that to the group. But no one needs to respond. However, if what someone says, there'll often be a pause, somebody else, it prompts a thought that is true for them in their own experience, then they will respond. But let's be comfortable with lots of silence. And then I'll say the point is to understand alterity, or I might not use alterity because it's a $10 academic word. The point is to understand the difference that we live and the different lenses through which we negotiate race and the different range of experiences that are in the room. And we're trying to learn about things that we have missed because our own identity has closed ourselves off from those. And then I'll say the point is not to convert. So my role as facilitator is if someone tries to convince someone else that their view is wrong, I will step in and say, no. Now you can speak your truth about how that view does not make sense because your own experience contradicts it, but we're not going to get into a winner, loser, I'm going to convert you to my correct way of thinking. So I keep the rules pretty simple. I don't lay a lot of stuff on them. The main thing is to make thinking before speaking a very, very acceptable dynamic. And I allow about an hour, and Bohm says, really, we need about 2.5 hours to do this. But you have to have an hour of space in which to do this. The biggest group I've done it with has been about 50. I have adapted it for smaller groups as well. But what I'm trying to do is to get people really to engage and listen to the fact that people's experiences are different around race. And then we do that maybe once. Then we'll come back. And if I have a long class, sometimes I teach in 3-hour periods, I'll say in the second part of the class, let's focus on where do we move from here? Where do we go from here? And we do the same process again. So people talk about where they go from here in terms of their own experience. So that's Bohm dialogue. Sorry, a long answer.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I want to bring in one more point that came up yesterday in chats in Slido and just came up in Slido again. This idea, again, not of shaming or blaming or converting, but even in your own speech just now, you said it might be strange that we talk about race coming from the sciences. Could you address this issue of STEM and how this, is this really something that's separate from STEM or from disciplines that fall under STEM? How do we think critically about race and equity-minded pedagogies in the context of STEM classrooms?
So I hear that all the time. There's a fantastic book, I included in at the end of this slides on how this work applies in mathematics, in STEM generally, but mathematics in particularly. So that's a really good resource I'd recommend. But I think, as I was trying to say yesterday, it doesn't matter whether you're teaching biochemistry or art history or whatever. In every discipline, there is a canon of what is considered to be canonical, foundational building blocks of knowledge of that discipline. That canon comes from somewhere. So one of the things that I think is good to do in any discipline with any students is to say, who counts as the authorities in this field? And let's look at things like gender and racial identity. So let's look at the founding, and usually it's the founding fathers of the discipline, not the founding mothers. Let's look at who the editors of the most prestigious journals in the field are. Let's look at the editorial boards. Let's look at the kind of methodologies that are most privileged. Where do those come from? Why is this methodology seen as more legitimate than another methodology? Let's look at assessment. Why are certain forms of assessment regarded as more innately legitimate and valid than others? And oftentimes, for example, this obviously varies to some degree, but orality, the sharing orally, demonstration of knowledge orally, is regarded as less valid in terms of a student's overall grade, for example, than is a written test or the writing of a paper or a mini thesis. Let's look at why individual assessment is privileged. Why is the emphasis so much on individual assessment? What does that say about collective cultures, indigenous ways of knowing, Afrocentric paradigms of knowing, I am because we are, where the emphasis on the collective construction of knowledge is so dominant? And yet we're, in our discipline, we're mostly assessing, again, I'm generalizing, but we're assessing using individual measures of assessment, how student A or student B performs on a test. So I think in any discipline, you can talk about the canonical knowledge, where it comes from, who are regarded as authorities, what forms of the creation of truth and knowledge are regarded as more legitimate than others, where do those constructions come from? And then finally, in terms of the applications of knowledge that our discipline generates, how is the knowledge applied in our discipline impacting the world outside? Who gets to benefit from the knowledge that we've produced? Are there disproportionalities in those benefits that people experience? So looking also at the applications of knowledge, I think those are things you do in any discipline. So that's just some kind of quick responses to the question. Now, you've probably heard me hold forth way too much. So I'm going to move us forward. Unless there's something burning, Valerie, we need to.
There was a quick comment that I missed in the Q&A in Slido that says, how do we offer discussion space that's more appropriate to the awareness of individuals who are more aware and enlightened? So the question is, are there different kinds of spaces for, as you were giving the math metaphor, right? That arithmetic and calculus metaphor.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think it's fine. It's problematic, but I've done this. And when I say it's fine, I mean, everything is problematic. Everything we do is problematic, right? One way or another. Always advantages, disadvantages, context changes everything. But I sometimes ask students, where do you think you are in terms of the development of knowledge around this, or your previous experience with race? Are you at a beginning level? Are you an intermediate level? Or are you at an advanced level? And people will, put that down in some way. And so I'll say, well, for this next exercise, I'm going to try us grouping ourselves into those self-assigned groups. So if you feel you're at beginning, go to that corner of the room. If you feel it intermediate, meet in the center. If you feel it advanced, go over by the screen or you know, the other corner. And then I'll pose the question and we'll talk about that. Even as I'm doing that though, I will say self-assigning has many inherent problems with it. And we often tend to assume that we're further along than we really are. I'll tell them when we get together and we talk about what you discussed in groups, one of my jobs is to point out when I feel your self-assignment was a little over-optimistic or not optimistic enough, you know, both ways. So I have done that in class. So I'd like to get us into, give you a screen break, give you some time to think. We're going to try this protocol. So a more complex protocol than the one we did yesterday, Circle of Voices, which I regard as an introductory protocol. This is more something I would introduce after we'd done the Circle of Voices several times, because it has more anxiety and complexity around it. But I'll say more about the protocol when we get back after the break. So why don't we reconvene round about, let's see, 10:40. That will give you a couple of minutes to make some notes about your responses to this question, just to get your mind focused on this. And hopefully some of the things that we've talked about so far this morning have helped to get you focused on this. And then just go and get fluids, use the bathroom, and move. And we'll see you all at 10:40. I'll leave this up during the break. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break and at least didn't have to look at that damn screen again for a few minutes and were able to avert your eyes from the little green dot that's dominated our lives over the last year or so. So we're going to move into a second protocol, give you plenty of time to do this. And the questions are around difficult dynamics that you have experienced around dealing with issues of race, racial identity, racism, and white supremacy, so on, depending on how you frame it. Or if this is work you're moving into, so you don't have a lot of experience to reflect back on, the second part of this question is probably more relevant for you, which is what kind of fears and uncertainties and doubts are you bringing into the work as you enter into it. So that's why the question is framed as it is. It's hopefully this will allow those with some experience to respond and share, and also those who are moving into the work to respond and share, because we're probably as with most groups at different spaces in this work. So here's how the process works. I'm going to give you the chance initially, again, to read your I am from prompts. Now, this should be optional. So if you really do feel it's an inauthentic exercise and it has no value for you, there were, I think, 6 responses to that effect, and clearly don't do it. You know, just kind of say who you are in terms of your location and disciplinary affiliation, departmental location, so on in the system. Then we're going to move into this particular protocol. And again, this is not something I would do initially with students. I would reserve it until we're into the course. So that's why deliberately I'm doing it on the second morning in the 2 mornings that we have together. So everybody will regroup and just think, all right, now we're going to focus on the question. And there will be a period of silence, and you've already had a couple of minutes to think about this. And then when someone is ready to make an opening response, the spirit moves through them, then they'll kick off and they'll say whatever they want to say, and try and keep your opening reflection to no more than 2 minutes. I mean, we can't be absolutely, we're not going to have a stopwatch or anything, but try to keep it to a couple of minutes initially. Then we're going to go around the group, but we're going to do it by last names that follow on alphabetically from the first person who spoke. So that after the first person has spoken, the next person to go will be alphabetically, but using last names. That person will take some time, no need to speak immediately, to think about what the first speaker has said, and then try and find something to respond to in the first speaker's comment. Now, this can be an agreement or a disagreement. You can extend the comment by saying, here's how what you said connects to my experiences, or here's how what you said doesn't connect to my experiences, and here's the problem I'm having in terms of building on that. And take up to a couple of minutes the second speaker. Then the next person alphabetically by last names follows on. And again, they pause, think about what the second speaker has said, and then try and build on and respond to what that second speaker says. So there's probably going to be pauses before each person speaks, because you need time to process, mull over, and think about what the second or the third speaker, the person just before you, has said. This means that the fifth speaker, the one who goes last, can't rehearse their contribution while the others are speaking, because what you as the fifth speaker says will depend on what the one before you, the fourth speaker, says. So this is a way of building very active listening skills. It's a way of taking the conversation deeper into the analysis of one or two issues. That's often what happens with circular response. But we also want to be open to raising other issues. So once you've gone through that opening round, each person responding to the, thinking about and then responding to the previous speaker's comments, then you move into open conversation, and you can talk about anything. So if something has been, you've been burning to say it, it's been bubbling inside you around the question, then you get the chance to say it. There's no ground rules after that first sharing. Sort of like a telephone game, the game telephone, in a way, in that you're responding to what the person before you has just said. So I'm going to allow about, say, half an hour for that. We can, let's see, we're at 11. Yeah, let's go till, let's say 20 past 11. So we'll reconvene at 11:20. And again, this is the question we're focusing on. And then this is the process that we're going to use. So see you all in about 33 minutes at 11:40. If you need less or more time, let me know and we can adjust accordingly. Welcome back, everybody. I know that for about 75 of you, your conversation was suddenly cut off by the time running out. So I apologize for that abruptness of, but hopefully that's a sign that there was some useful things happening within the group and people were still eager to hear from each other and to discuss and compare and contrast experiences. So I did say in the send round a message, we're not going to ask for reports from each group, but I would like to open things up for some sharing of the issues that seemed, if there were some that took up a lot of the group's time, or questions that came up in your groups. Maybe start with that, issues or questions, and you can use Zoom chat to post these, and Valerie will keep an eye on those as those are coming in. But if there is, as those are coming in, anything that you know, you can still speak verbally, even though we're a group of 100 plus. Anything anyone would like to share about an issue or question as the group chat, the Zoom chat is filling up. Yes. Thank you. Sorry, glasses time. Lenny, love to hear what you have to say.
So one of the things that our group, this isn't a question exactly. Well, no, it is a question. One of the things our group discussed was about the challenges of doing this work when one is a non-tenure track employee. And I'm wondering if you and or the hive mind that we have here can think of ways that the UW system can help support these professors who are having these really challenging conversations in ways that students might not always appreciate, but that are so important. So maybe you have suggestions about what you've seen other systems do.
I mean, it's such an important dynamic to identify. And yes, I have seen examples of institutions that have rewritten promotion and tenure criteria to include attention to this work as an expected part of professional behavior. For some, that means bringing these issues into class. For others, it means more showing how you're engaged in a process of self-education around it. But for staff, for hiring, for performance appraisals, for standards of promotion, reappointment, and tenure, systemically, this needs to be built in as an expectation. And as I said yesterday, systemically, if UW across its multiple campuses is really going to take this seriously, and it's an important institutional priority, then we have to rewrite institutional workloads and find ways of acknowledging that this is difficult work. And then any evaluations of teaching that we do that focus on student responses should include questions or should be probing for the extent to which the instructor challenged me to think about issues that I had never addressed before, the extent to which the instructor made me productively uncomfortable, the extent to which I was introduced to new racial perspectives that had not been considered previously by me. So those have to be written specifically into any evaluation form where students are giving responses to teachers. Because, and also I think the positionality of the teacher, someone mentioned this yesterday, is absolutely crucial. So for someone like myself to come in and talk about my own racism that I carry within me and the way I'm trying to address it, and to acknowledge that I'm constantly making mistakes. I tend to get rewarded for that, and you know, people say, oh, how vulnerable or brave this is. I get a lot of kudos for doing it. A colleague of color comes in, a female colleague of color in particular comes in, but this applies generally, or a female, we want to just focus on gender, says those things, and the response is often very, very different in a predominantly white institution. They get penalized, they are regarded as incompetent, as not having, they're not fully competent. So an admission of mistake is not a sign of vulnerability, it's a sign of affirmative action, having foisted someone on us who is not really qualified to academically to be an instructor. So that's why I think I wanted to say this in my closing comments. Doing this as a team of different identities, both racial and gender, is so crucial, and that's what was missing from today, in that I was doing it solo. Typically, I work with a team. A colleague, a younger African-American woman, Dr. Brianna French, and we can talk about the dynamics of how evaluations are given and received and so on. So long answer, but systemically, you can't do this classroom stuff without systemic support. And that's what often institutional leadership doesn't get. You know, classrooms are not independent zones. They function within an institution and a culture. Dinesh, do you want to say something, and then we'll have a look at what the chat is bringing up?
Thank you, Stephen. Two questions. One of the question which came into our group discussion, very important question. How the white resource person or teacher who are sitting, let's say, in a classroom where there is a mixed group of students, and there is this fear of not committing mistake, you know, that, oh, I may say something that can offend. So that's one question, if you do have some suggestion there. And then one of the discussion came over is, what about this complete architecture of control, the hierarchical pyramidal structure of control into the system, where your existence depends on where you are into the pyramid. And as soon I leave that position in that pyramid, my existence is completely gone. So into the system precedence existence depends that there are lower grade people. Associate professors position depends because there are assistant professor. You were just mentioned about the, you know, about the tenure and non-tenure. The data suggests that there are more lectures into the system or academic institution than what there before. So in one side, definitely we advocate, but on the other side, into the real practical ground, we see that the gap is being increasing in, you know, consistently. So do you have some suggestion there? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dinesh. I mean, my suggestions only is that, unfortunately, for many of us, being an academic means also being an organizer and developing solidarity with others and developing institutions and consortium. And we, at St. Thomas, we have an anti-racist coalition, including staff, administrators, and faculty, of about 250 strong, completely independent of the institution, that speaks as a unit around these issues. And so that short-term hires, lecturers, non-tenured, adjunct, don't have to take the risk of raising this stuff. The coalition will raise the stuff on their behalf. Valerie, what about some things we can address in the...
Yes, one group was discussing the anxieties of open student conflict with each other. What do you do when you've tried to calm down that conflict, but it tends to escalate, perhaps even beyond the classroom?
Yes, I know. So this fear of losing control of having things get very, very personal is a very real one. And that is going to happen. However, there are things you can do to anticipate that and prepare for it, which is the importance in that slide earlier I mentioned about using particular protocols, introducing people to brave space. We could do a whole morning just on what that looks like. But then when people start to focus on personhood, on calling someone out because of who they are, rather than behaviors or actions or comments that they've made, that's where you constantly have to step in and say, this is what, we're not doing that in this class. We're focusing on behaviors and actions and understanding that behaviors and actions come from somewhere. It's not a sign of individual moral failing. Someone's inherently evil. It is a learned response. So what is the learned response? How has a system of white supremacy, assumed white superiority, framed the behavior, let's say, that we've just seen? So you constantly bring it back to that. I also, as instructor, will try and, or my co-instructor, will draw upon experiences when we have engaged in the same behaviors, because we are both imperfect beings, that we see students doing. I have said things, many things that have diminished people. I've said things that are racist, in that they are reaffirming the importance of white identity without my realizing it, taking up space. Sorry. So you use your own experience as well, I think, and this gets easier the more experience you have. It's difficult when the first time that you do it. And then you remind students what brave space looks like. That yes, we can have these very difficult conversations and things will be said and will be very emotional, and that's to be expected. But again, a feature of brave space is coming back, I'm repeating myself now. We focused on racism as a learned behavior that's structurally internalized within us. Always come back to that. Not that racism is a personal failing of individual prejudice. It's a learned behavior, and that's your teaching role, I think. Yeah, what else?
Thank you. Are there other comments? I don't see any currently in the Q&A in Slido. You could post there anonymously if you felt comfortable, or into the chat, or raise your hand and share with Stephen.
While people are thinking and posting, let me just, since we're on, I wanted to kind of end up where we began, with the elephant in the room of the fact that this is a white person leading a diversity initiative. So I just wanted to come back to that and say, for me, given that I work in a predominantly white system, as you know, many campuses in the UW system are similar, these are things, hard truths that I've learned. If I see racist behavior in myself or others, I have to call it out. Now, the way I call it out is by trying to call people in rather than calling them out is crucial. And so that's where the focus on learned racism as a learned practice comes in, a learned behavior. But if I don't, if I let it slide and think no one has noticed, I will have lost all credibility with any of the students or colleagues of color. I have to start with the assumption that for people of color, everything is seen through the lens of race. Now, some will say that is not true for me. But as a working assumption, I found it's a pretty good one to be following. If something is pointed out that I've done, I must acknowledge this, not try and explain it away, not say I was misunderstood, regard an example of someone pointing out something that they see in me as a learned racist behavior as truth. Start from that point. I must never ask people of color to teach me about racism. If they choose to do that, wonderful. But figuring out what to do is my responsibility. I must never show up saying, I'm your ally, or I'm your accomplice, or your co-conspirator. I should strive to act in that way, but I've seen so many examples of what Latham Thomas calls optical allyship. Using the right words, wearing particular items of clothing, saying I'm your ally. Don't do that. Act as an ally, and if someone to you as a white person says, I regard you as an ally, wear that designation with pride. But don't come in and say, you can depend on me, I'm your ally. And then finally, I must strive to do this work in a team. And so I have on the screen here, Dr. Brianna French. She and I have something called anti-racist-training.org. We've had to protect our website. We've been trolled and attacked personally so much. But if anyone is interested in getting to that website, just ask me for the password and I'll give you it. And you can ask me directly anything by going to my homepage, stephenbrookfield.com. You can contact me directly, stephenbrookfield.com.
Thank you. I see one more question. Anything in particular you would recommend for teaching students how to think in terms of systems?
Boy, this seems very self-congratulatory, but in the book that I just come out called Becoming a White Anti-Racist that I wrote with my colleague, Mary Hess, we have a chapter in there on getting students to think structurally. And we talk about different classroom exercises that we've used to do this. So I'll try and put that chapter on getting students to think structurally with its references up on my homepage for free download. So just go to stephenbrookfield.com, Becoming a White Anti-Racist, click on that. I won't tell the publisher that I'm doing this. Okay, so hopefully that'll be on there this afternoon. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Laura, to sort of close things out with some reflections.
I think I'm doing the closing reflection, so I'd like to start by a moment of gratitude to bookend my comments. Really, I'm grateful that we got to be here together. Thank you to Dr. Stephen Brookfield for 2 days of engaging and stimulating workshops on equity-minded pedagogy. Thank you for modeling. I think that was one of the really profound pieces of this for me personally, the ways in which you were modeling how we can continue our critically reflective journeys through innovative technologies, social media, creative small group discussion strategies, designed with intentionality and an ever-evolving idea of equity-minded teaching. Although many of us miss the particular embodied interactions in the retreat, almost camp-like experience of faculty college when we're face-to-face, this week reinforced how nourishing and necessary it is for us as lifelong learners to pause, to reflect, and to gather as a community, even as a virtual one. Thank you all for being here with us. I'm truly grateful for this bucket-filling time and space. Reflecting specifically on our workshops during the last 2 days, Dr. Brookfield opened the difficult conversation of acknowledging the multiplicity of worlds in the classroom, and particularly the ways in which race shapes the worlding of these worlds by sharing examples of calling in activities. He demonstrated how we might situate our own intersectional positionalities, show vulnerabilities, and offer students a chance to speak back, to continue to undo the image of a teacher as a kind of sage on the stage. In small breakout groups, we practiced the Where I'm From activity using the Circle of Voices approach. Our comments in the groups on chat and on Slido also echoed our students' possible concerns. Some of us were keenly aware that these activities require a secure position of privilege, without which many of us might not be able to share authentically, to disclose genuine experiences, or to express failures as easily as Dr. Brookfield does and did. However, providing this space and allowing us a chance to voice these issues, and today bringing them to the forefront at the beginning of our time together, functions yet again as an example of modeling the realities of complex interactions about privilege, power, race, and equity-minded strategies. Addressing equity, power, and race, Dr. Brookfield provided not only scholarly emphases on equity as, quote, the fight against dominant ideologies such as white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, and transphobia, end quote, but also discussed how our students often approach equity as what is fair or unfair in the particular cultural space of the classroom. He shared examples today of students, especially students of color, who expressed visceral reactions, feeling sick by white instructors attempting a performance of wokeness or allyship, which undid the construction of a brave space. In our breakout rooms, we practiced the circular response technique to discuss our fears and uncertainties for feeling able to address adequately racial identities and racism in the classroom. And yet, the message from these 2 days is not for us to retreat and feel paralyzed by these fears, but rather to move forward, equipped with the perhaps ironically comforting knowledge that we will fail and failure is okay. As mentioned in our equity-minded training earlier this week, as we talked about equity-minded wellness, in terms of grappling with microaggressions and mistakes related to race and equity, the most proactive approach is to design a plan for failure. The takeaways from this week also involve allowing ourselves and each other some grace, not to blame or feel guilty, but rather to adopt a kind of good, better, best approach that embraces failure as central to real growth and change. In the concrete examples of where do we go from here, Dr. Brookfield suggests for us that we understand white privilege and power as an unconscious phenomenon, he kept saying earlier, as learned behavior, and not having to worry about how race makes things difficult for you or anticipate how to negotiate barriers and survive emotionally. Ultimately, what we can do is strive to model anti-racist awareness in our own contributions. With these suggestions, Dr. Brookfield encourages us to continue our critically reflective work. His ideas do not advocate cultural suicide, but rather emphasize the fourth lens of feedback mentioned in his book, that we utilize our own personal experience as a guide and a way to navigate the other lenses of feedback, students' eyes, our colleagues, and academic scholarship. Our work this week on equity-minded wellness and equity-minded pedagogy serves once again as a call to join this ongoing struggle, to check our assumptions, and to learn how to swim in the waters of the worlds that shape our classrooms and beyond. As highlighted this week, equity-minded approaches in teaching about race in the classroom, they're not just for those of us who specialize in cultural studies, but rather it is inherent in how we all move in the classroom, how we create a syllabus, design a classroom activity, or determine student learning via discipline-specific assessment processes. Dr. Brookfield mentioned questioning the canon of any discipline, of who counts as the authority, of what assumptions each discipline make that reflects biases of race, gender, class, etc. Sharing my own biases from the discipline of history, as I teach about the history of science, medicine, or about the body, I try to help students to question intentionally how scientific disciplines descend from the world historical power realities of the Enlightenment that attempted to define universal knowledge, but were profoundly shaped by the dominant lens of white male Western European privilege. How do we, all of us, unpack the social construction of race and racism, stemming from the invention of ideas and language in the 1700s and sometimes before, as a legacy that continues into our classrooms today, all of our classrooms? Our very notions of what constitutes knowledge, the epistemological questions of not only what we know, but how we know in all of our disciplines are shaped by race, gender, class, and other intersectional identities. Again, not to blame or shame ourselves, or as Dr. Brookfield said, to convert someone, but how do we continue to unpack our own assumptions, including disciplinary assumptions? In the end, I would like to conclude with a quote from the conclusion of Dr. Brookfield's second edition of his book about becoming a critically reflective teacher. He ends with this reflection. I've learned that racial dynamics are far more pervasive and complex than I'd previously imagined, and that race and gender constantly frame how different teachers are perceived. I'm struggling to work out how best to manage team teaching, incorporate social media, and avoid power abuses. In other words, I'm still in the process of becoming a critically reflective teacher. On behalf of the OPID Advisory Council, thank you everyone for joining us for this nourishing week of Faculty College. A special thank you to our presenters, Dr. Curleen de Blair, Dr. Jesse Owen, and Dr. Stephen Brookfield. Special thanks to Diane Reddy and Mary Beth Liebem for opening and closing the first part of the week on equity-minded wellness. Thank you to the Wisconsin Teaching Scholars and Fellows. Faculty College, as we mentioned, marks the official kickoff to our summer training together. A special thank you for all the work done by my co-director, Heather Pelzel, and as well as Jessica Van Sluten and Andre Ivanov for their insightful reflections. And finally, a message of genuine gratitude to the work of the OPID Executive Committee, to the Council, and especially to Faya Kindes, our coach and our guide. Thank you so much for your time.